stream from Language Culture and Dr. Lou, of course. And last couple weeks, I did my Friday night live stream is more focused on culture and cultural goings on in the weeks. And so this time, I'd like to do something that's more linguistic, language-based concept, language-based theme, which is how is French from Quebec different from French from France, which is a question that I do get kind of a lot from students and from, well, other people who know that I'm teaching French at a university and know that I specialize in North American varieties of French. And and it's really not so confusing and not so much different than French from France if you really think about it. But I guess first I'd like to sort of go into how did France come to Quebec? How did it come to be where the Québécois are speaking so much French? And I do think it's pretty amazing that there's still so much French spoken in Canada because the majority language federally, nationwide anyway, is English. And English is a language that tends to sort of come out and cross other languages. Um, like other languages have a hard time maintaining their status when it comes to, well, when they're competing with English. And somehow in Canada, they still maintain a good population of French, which is focused more than anything else around the province of Quebec. And now, French has only been legally the official language of Quebec since 1977, so for less than 50 years now. And that was during the, what did they call, the Quiet Revolution, La Révolution Tranquille, when the Québécois got quite political in the 1960s and 1970s. And so that's how Law 101 was passed, also known as the Charter of the French Language. And that's what made French the sole official language of the province of Quebec, meaning education had to happen in French, commerce and other, well, business was having to go on in French and all this. And so that's, again, dates just back from the 1970s um, when the Québécois got quite political because, well, Anglophones were really dominating politically and business wise and everything. So they had to maintain a little French. And since then, French has held up pretty well there. But I'd like to get into how did French first get to Quebec, to the province of Quebec. And that goes way back to the 1500s, pretty much. And that is, I would say, well, we got to go back to Jacques Cartier, who in 1534 discovered the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which is, well, we know it now as the St. Lawrence Bay, which leads into the St. Lawrence River. And then Cartier went exploring along the St. Lawrence River, which really opened up the interior of Canada to European settlers. Um, and and then, of course, it wasn't until 1608 that Quebec City was finally founded, which is now the province of, the capital of the province of Quebec. And and that was by Samuel de Champlain, who was another explorer who had a lot to do with well, colonizing and settling New France. At the time, it was called New France. And I don't mean Nouvelle France in the larger sense, including the rest of Francophone North America, the other French colonies in North America, which did, of course, include Louisiana, which went from, well, the current state of Louisiana as far north as the Great Lakes, even. It was a whole lot bigger than the state is right now. And also l'Acadie and Acadie, which I call in English Acadia. That was founded right where uh, in I guess in 1604, so just before Quebec City was founded, St. Croix Island, which is near where the state of Maine borders on Canada, and Acadia was, well, it included northern Maine and, well, a lot of what today are the maritime provinces. So Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Labrador, and all of that. And so that's not the kind of French we're talking about, though, because that's Acadian French, which you might know. Uh, Cajun French is a kind of Acadian French, for instance. And the Acadians were the ones who traveled down the Mississippi River all the way to New Orleans as well to become the Cajuns. And so in Quebec, which again was pretty much the center of La Nouvelle France and the most colonized, the most developed part of La Nouvelle France, and La Nouvelle France, so New France, was basically where the province of Quebec is today, and I think a little of Eastern Ontario. But for the longest time, it was just called Canada, the Canada, and then over time became Lower Canada, and then became called Eastern Canada, and eventually became the colony of Quebec, so the colony of Quebec. And so pretty much Quebec and that area has been the stronghold of France in Canada more or less the whole time. Has been there, even though the French didn't become the sole official language of Quebec until the 1970s. And so, yeah, so that's, we're talking the 16th century and early 17th century. French was getting a really good foothold, and all that was before even the Mayflower showed up in Plymouth, Massachusetts. A lot of Americans, we end up thinking, oh, Plymouth must have come first, but that's just when the English got there. And the English were not the first Europeans to be settling in North America, right? You had the French were there, the Spanish were there, the Dutch were also there, and that's, well, why we have plenty of Dutch history in the Hudson Valley of New York State, among other places. And so French has been around a long time, but the Québécois didn't get political and make French the sole official language by law until the 1970s. And I do get a lot of questions about the difference between Quebec French and French from France. And it's kind of funny coming from an American, if that question comes from an American, I will often reply, hi there in the chat. Nice to see you. Nice to see you all there. Anyway, um, and when people do talk about Quebec City as the oldest city in Canada, they're mostly just talking oldest European settled city in Canada, and so not the oldest city in North America altogether, but pretty darn old as far as Europe is concerned. But I think if you are considering it that way, you're kind of ignoring how the Vikings got to Canada first. I think the year was like 1021 AD or something like that. So the Vikings had gotten there long, long time, and they too, excuse me, and they too were in the maritime provinces pretty much. They founded L'Anse-aux-Meadows, which is in, well, on the island of Newfoundland. It's part of the province of Newfoundland, Labrador. And so, yeah, I'm finding, as someone with a little Danish blood in him, I always find it a annoying when the Vikings and their discoveries are left out of North American history anyway. Um, and so, yeah, I wanted to talk a bit today about exactly what the differences are. As a linguist can see, as somebody who does sociolinguistics and regional variation in French, as well, national variation in French, and what is primary the difference. Again, I said often I got this question from Americans who my first reply to an American asking what's the difference between Québécois and French from France, I asked, okay, I mentioned, okay, it's very similar to the difference between American English and English, right? So English from the US and English from the UK. And I know I'm saying American English and UK English and Quebec French as well as French from France. I'm not assuming that everybody in any of those countries speaks exactly identically to each other, right? Um, just sort of making broader generalizations that we can use to distinguish between different national varieties of languages. And so, getting back to what's the difference between American English and British English, a lot of people can sort of naturally tell that it's mostly just pronunciation and a handful of vocabulary words, a few vocabulary words, and not like hundreds of thousands or anything, but just dozens and dozens. And that's pretty much the big theme of when I'm talking about what's the difference between these two language varieties is it's mostly pronunciation and some lexical items, meaning vocabulary. And that Americans can. Oh, well, it's nice to know you're understanding me. You said not clear, but I hope it's not a sound problem so much. Uh, anyway, if so, like I was getting back to making a comparison between American English to British English as opposed to Quebec French to French from France, is that we do notice that it's mostly just pronunciation. It is the same language after all. So if you get over that feeling that if you're a native speaker, then other people should be speaking the language just like you are. If you get over that part, it's pretty easy to understand each other. And oftentimes, people who say they can't really understand someone from another country speaking the same language natively, they're often, well, being a little snobbish, being a little ethnocentric. If you just get over your assumptions that your way of speaking is better than theirs, it ends up opening up your ears and you end up being able to understand the other side pretty well because it's all the same language, different varieties, but the same language. So pretty much, um, and one example from that is Americans, we don't use the word pants the same way that the British do, right? And so that's always something to bear in mind if you're an American and you're traveling in England or elsewhere in the United Kingdom. Don't use the word pants because they will understand it very much differently than we do, meaning they will understand it to mean underpants or underwear as opposed to um, pants in the sense of, well, the British would often say trousers. We also have the word slacks, so we're talking outerwear in the American sense. And so that's very similar to how we have differences from between French in North America and in Europe. Um, and so in in Quebec, one thing to bear in mind is that they were settled a very long time ago by the French. And I'm talking again in the 16th century and 17th century, so the 1500s and 1600s. That's when La Nouvelle France was getting developed, right, in the area that's modern day Quebec. And again, Quebec was the most developed part of La Nouvelle France, New France again. And part of why languages are different in a place that was once a colony of the country where the language originally came from is that once, again, if let's say French got implanted into Quebec back in the 1530s around, and so it's been nearly 500 years. And in that 500 years, the language has continued to develop in France, and it's also continued to develop in Quebec. And so, in some ways, just like Americans sound to the British, the Quebec sound to the French, kind of like country folk in a way, because out in rural areas, you end up maintaining older forms of language. Like there's these archaic forms that come out that people in uh, the country who originally had the colonies, right, English or France, they have moved on and started saying things another way. So a lot of ways that makes it sound a little archaic to them and a little like Hicks, kind of in a way. And in other ways, both languages are developing and having contact with other languages. And this to me gets into how Québécois has this reputation of having a lot of English stuffed into it, a lot of Anglicisms and whatnot. And I would say that it's more true that the Anglicisms, the use of English in France and in France and Quebec, English appears in both of those a bit, but differently. Differently to each other, and so the Anglicisms are a little different, and so are some. Well, one kind of Anglicism is a calque, where something that gets translated literally, um, and especially when idiomatic expressions and idioms get translated literally, because idioms really don't translate literally, and so that's kind of a big no-no. And so. Certain different Anglicisms, like, certain different calques, like, which are a kind of Anglicism, like one good one a lot of people point to is to say a hot dog. In France, it's hot dog, right? They borrowed that word right from English. Hot dog, spelled the same way we spell hot dog. And whereas Quebec is known for un chien chaud, and chien is dog, so hot, and so that's a translation of hot dog right into French. And so people think of that as a way of having more English in it, but it's also a way of kind of Frenchifying this English instead of just borrowing it outright. And I think a big reason why French borrowings from English and French Canadian or Quebecois borrowings for English are very different is because in France, the French language is in no way endangered, and it's no way in minority status as compared to its relationship with English. Whereas in the province of Quebec, they're federally in a minority situation, so they really have to stick up for their French and keep it. And that's part of why Quebec has this office of the French language of Quebec, l'Office de la langue française au Québec, I think is what it's called, and which is a lot like the French Academy, l'Académie Française in France. the parts of the government, branches of the government that are very much there to describe what is French, what is not French, what is good French, what should we avoid in French, and all of those. They are, well, government grammarians pretty much. And one product of this is that how sometimes when you have an English borrowing, a borrowing of an English word into French, it's very different in France than it is in Quebec because, well, the French might have a very obvious one, like le weekend, which is spelled week and then end. It's hyphenated in French, not in English anymore, or at least not in American English anyway, but still direct word, and it looks like English on its face, and it pretty much sounds like that, right? The weekend. And whereas in Quebec, where they've had to fight a little harder and react to being in minority situation and protect their language with a little more vigor, um, you have them going to a term like la fin de semaine. So la fin de semaine, so the end of week. To me, I love that one because it's a perfectly French language way of saying the same thing instead of just borrowing the weekend, um, just saying this in a French way, la fin de semaine, right? And so I don't find that necessarily an Anglicism, but more of finding a good French way to do that. And so I'm not going to go into too much scientific stuff in linguistics, talking about uh, very specific studies that I've seen, because I would have done the stream a little differently using software, so I could share my screen to show you some images if I wanted to do it this way. I wanted to talk about generalities, like, again, big difference between French Canadian French, aka Québécois French, and French from France. Mostly it's phonetic. For the large part, it's just phonetic. Pronunciation is a little different. Like, for example, the nasal vowels are often shifted a little. I actually know someone who did her doctoral dissertation about this and sort of taken the three main nasal vowels in standard French. We have on, un, and on. Whereas in Quebec French, they became more like on, un, and un, which just basically, well, the dissertation that I know of that focused on this just sort of showed how each of the nasal vowels, they just sort of rotated a little bit in the mouth in the way it's pronounced. But if you're really listening to them, even though they're not pronouncing it the same way you would, you can understand it because, again, it's the same language, so you've got the same structure behind all of it. And again, I also pointed to there are some lexical items, aka different vocabulary used in Quebec than in France. By the way, I use the term Canadian French or French Canadian, and I wanted to clarify how that is not the same thing, and it's not the only kind of French that you will hear in Canada, because it's not the same thing as Acadian French. French Canadian, when we say French Canadian French, or just Canadian French, we are referring to Québécois, Quebec French, and all of the offshoots, which are other varieties of French in Canada that are pretty much west of Quebec, like Franco-Ontarian, for instance, is a kind of French Canadian, we could say. And same with French in Western Canada as well. All those are offshoots from Quebec. And so the kind of French that's heard in Canada but different is Acadian French. And like I mentioned, Acadians were the folks who, some of which while the English were committing genocide against the French and the First Nations. A lot of folks traveled down the Mississippi River to Louisiana, which was already a French colony, so there were already French speakers there. Actually, by the time they arrived, France had sold it to Spain for a minute, which is why the um, Cajun flag has a lot of red and gold on it. That's an homage to the Spanish accepting them. And they were joining other people who spoke French, colonial French, and all that. So that's Acadian, and that is, again, in northern Maine and in the Maritime provinces. So, again, Newfoundland, Labrador, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick. So the Atlantic provinces or the Maritime provinces. So when I'm talking about that kind right now, I want to talk specifically about French and Quebec, and to give you some examples of what I mean by some lexical items, some vocabulary being different in Quebec than it is in France. Oh, hi Sunshine, how's it going? Um, they made fun of your accent in northern Quebec. Seems like we only found people who spoke English once we brought you with us. Yeah, that's true. We did mostly find people who spoke English, although I did get to use my French a little bit. And yeah, they often. I also don't speak French like the way that the Québécois do. I also don't speak it the way that French people from France do. I speak my own French, I guess. Heavily influenced by the Rhone Alps accent in France, and also by my having lived in the province of Quebec, and of course visited many other times. Sunsun, you might remember I had a boyfriend living in Montreal while I'm living in Albany, so I went up there many times. Um, so my French is not the same as theirs, but I understand them just fine. And why is that? That I can understand them in both countries just fine because it's the same language. It's pretty much same thing. And oh, you swear that the first time there was no one who spoke English, or at least not with you. That must have been tough. Trying to work with your rudimentary French without being able to find English speakers. I do find that great. I'm feeling so lucky while I travel that I do speak English and French and a bit of Spanish. That allows me to go a lot of different places. Although my Spanish is not so great as my English or my French, but it's um, it's workable. I've used it while traveling too. And so, to give some examples of the lexical items, a different vocabulary that people know as being Québécois, and how it's a little different from things people might say in France, I thought of a textbook I used to use that has a section. Well, I'll show you the textbook. This is, well, an older edition of it. Français sur le monde francophone. Um, this is the Media Enhanced 4th edition, which I've used this for many times in my career. 2nd edition, 3rd edition, 4th edition, then the Media Enhanced 1st edition, and then the 5th edition. But where I'm teaching right now, we don't use it anymore because it got too expensive for our students. So we're using an open educational resource instead. So I remembered that they had a good little list of terms as to give examples of how French in Quebec is a little different than French from France. And again, this is a textbook that's geared towards teaching French to native English speakers. And this version is specifically more for native American English speakers. And so I wanted to give you a few examples And I did remember in this that there are some really good ones, really salient ones. So I wanted to include these. And again, I'm not implying that every single person in the province of Quebec speaks exactly the same, or that everyone in the country of France speaks exactly the same as each other. But these are, yeah, general observations we can make. And none of the some of these terms are a little slangy, but not. I'm not trying to encourage, trying to will imply that these are super current and especially slangy terms. They're just ones that are known to be spoken in Quebec and terms known to be spoken in France. So, in and I will go through a few of them. For one, in France, there's a column that says en France, so that's in France. People say this. And then the other is au Québec, meaning in the province of Quebec. People say that. And so en France, the first example they give is the word bonjour, which of course means hello or good morning, but hello. And so if in France they use bonjour to say hello, which by the way, one of my little French lessons du jour mentioned how it's not bonjour all the time. It can also be bonsoir, or even in the afternoon, it might be bon après-midi in France too. Um, and so the Quebec equivalent to that they give again in C'est nous um, is allo, spelled A-L-L and then an O with a circumflex over it, allo. And I thought that's a good example to point out because it is interesting how it's not always the same first go uh, to how you say hello. Like in Quebec, you're not necessarily going to go from bonjour first all the time because you have other ways, hello. But this also goes back to my point that is the same language and you will understand each other if you get over your well you're feeling better than everyone else and excuse me and and what makes me think of that is because allo is a word that I used when I lived in France too. That's pretty much how I answered my phone usually. I would say oui allo as soon as I picked up the phone. So that goes to show how a French speaker from France would totally understand that if a Quebecois speaker of French Canadian French said to them, hello. It's not like things will get lost in translation. Same language. So get over yourself and you will understand the other person just fine in most cases. And that's true not just of Quebec French, but also Acadian French and Franco American French. Folks can easily travel in France and make themselves understood and be understood by others, but it does takes a little getting over um, that notion that everybody should speak your language the same exact way that you do. Um, and so another example is when you mean, oh, not bad. In France, they may say pas mal, right, which literally means not bad, pas mal. And in Quebec, pas pire, which literally means not worse. Pire is worse as compared to just bad in most places, and pas pire, not worse. And so that is also something that a French speaker from Europe talking either Switzerland or Belgium or France or wherever would totally understand it. It would be maybe new to them that use of papier, but totally understandable. So again, it's all the same language. And so the difference comes down to some pronunciation, some phonetic things like the nasal vowels that I mentioned earlier, and also a handful of words, just a small number of vocabulary items of words that you're going to use. And a really good one where remember how I said when when Quebec became a unified language, well, French became a unified language in Quebec versus the way it kept evolving in France. Um, um, Part of the difference is they make different borrowings from other languages that they're coming into contact. And before I get into that, I just like to mention I mentioned a unified French right there. And did you know that French was unified where more people could understand each other in Quebec before that ever happened in France? Because we had, of course, in the um, 1600s, so the 17th century. Well, there's a couple of theories about how France got regularized and unified in Quebec, and one theory is this happened by because of les filles du roi, which means the daughters of the king, and the king in question was the Sun King, Louis XIV. Um, Sorry, I'm not having much time to read out your comments over Sunshine, but they are um, very useful. And yeah, some of the roads you gotta use to get to northern Quebec are a pain in the A, right? Anyway, so the one theory is that this is because les filles du roi, because in La Nouvelle France, in New France, there were not a lot of women there. The colonists, like only 6.3 of them were women. So you got mostly men, and the difference was even still getting worse. And so Louis XIV tried to, well, do something about it because in order to have a population to populate the colonies, you need enough numbers of both sexes to have families and have babies and all that and build the population, right? And so between 1663 and 1673, about 800 women, known as the daughters of the king, les filles du roi, they left France by boat to come marry and make families to colonize, well, Nouvelle France to help that population blow up. And so that's one theory on how France got unified there. And again, this is in the 17th century, so the 1600s, which is long before the French Revolution. And even at the French Revolution was started in 1789, so more than a century later, after this, after the Filles du Roi thing, France came together as a republic, and they still didn't have a unified France all over the place. They had to make a lot of language policy and planning to make that happen still, and so Quebec already had a unified version of French. Now, the other theory has to do with how a lot of the colonists came from through certain ports in northwestern France, in Brittany and Normandy and other places along the Atlantic Ocean in northwestern France. And so they would come there, stay there, and get to speaking more similarly to each other. And then they take a long boat ride over where the French is still becoming even more similar to each other. And then they settled in New France. And so, yeah, so that's the other way people suspect that people, or rather theorize that France got unified in Quebec. But either way, regardless of which theory you go with, it's totally it totally means that Quebec had one unified French language long, long before the country of France did. And that was long before the French were all like with their heads and whatnot, you know. Anyway, um, and so getting back to my point about how France and had borrowed different things from English over all those centuries and in different ways. Um, because French and English have been in big contact, a lot of contact, especially in North America and Canada, but also in Europe. And that explains, well, why in Europe they're saying le weekend in French from France. Because, yeah, obviously they had contact enough with often England, their neighbor, um, to get something there. Whereas in Quebec, it's you're more likely to hear somebody say la fin de semaine or la fin de semaine, but and it's because we're borrowing differently. And one interesting borrowing for me is when you're trying to say that something is fun. Oh, this is fun, if you want to say that. In French from France, you're likely to hear someone saying, or you're likely to say, c'est amusant, which is an adjective. So it's not really saying this is fun so much as this is funny, because the noun of fun, that noun that we have in English, the thing that is fun, um, that didn't exist in France. So what did the Québécois do? They borrowed it. And so instead of saying c'est amusant, to say this is fun, they might say c'est le fun, because spelled the same way, F-U-N, c'est le fun, and maintained a little English language pronunciation on it. It's not fun, F-U-N, it's fun. Um, and so, yeah, and so that points to the two languages end up being a little differently, but different because in part they're borrowing from English differently. And and this brings me to, well, another point to say my boyfriend in France, and in a lot of textbooks we learn, oh, you say mon petit ami, with a little liaison in there, which literally means my little friend. But that's my boyfriend, if we want to say it like that in France. Whereas in Quebec, English borrowing, mon chum, spelled C-H-U-M. And that to me is kind of funny because in English, when I use the word chum, or I don't actually use that word much, but I hear it. When I hear people saying the word chum, I think friends. Oh, my chums are my friends. I don't think romantic relationship automatically, but still, it's a cute little borrowing. So for my boyfriend, mon chum. And that to me, again, I'm not trying to do most current slang at all, just things that are known as Quebec French. And and then if you want to say my girlfriend, right, in France, you're likely to hear someone saying ma petite amie. Ma for my, petite, little or small, and ami, friend, ma petite amie. Whereas in Quebec, the term is ma blonde, which means my blonde, and blonde spelled B-L-O-N-D-E, the way that it's spelled when the adjective is or noun is feminine. And that reminds me of, because it doesn't matter what color her hair is, she's just being referred to as your girlfriend. And it doesn't matter what color her hair is. And that reminds me of something that used to be pretty popular slang in the US. I don't know if anybody is still saying that or not, but because I'm not so cool anymore. But I had a roommate whose ex-boyfriend still kind of thought they were together and anything. He was always calling her Shorty, his Shorty. And it had nothing to do with her height because honestly, she was not much shorter than him. And it's not about that. So in a similar way, well, you're not actually talking about somebody's actual height if you're calling them shorty in English, in a diminutive way in the sense that you're calling them your girlfriend, that is. Um, when you're saying ma blonde in Quebec, you're not meaning that this woman is blonde. You're calling her your girlfriend. So to me, that's really funny too. And again, I already gave you the. No, I'm saying they also came up with the example of the weekend in France versus la fin de semaine in Quebec, which I say goes to how in Quebec they've had to really fight to maintain their French language and not have it crossed out by English. So they don't always use borrowings from English that are so English on its face, like dog, hot dog, or weekend. And and then there's other words that are just um, um, yeah, they're just words that we don't have any external influence, any influence from another language, but they just happen to evolve usage a little differently. If you're talking about chatting with your friends, chatting in French, we might use the term discuter, which of course also means to discuss. Whereas in Quebec, the term jaser, spelled Jaser, is an ER verb. So jaser, that's a chat. And again, even if you are from France and you're going to Quebec and you're hearing this word, you can totally pick it up by context. And so it won't keep you from understanding anybody ever. Anyway, and oh, I see you. I see you in there, sunshine, looking stuff up. Oh, about Labrador. She could complete her late husband's goal of exploration after he perished, huh? But it is interesting. I should have kept better track of that little history as you're giving it. I hope other people are getting something out of it in the chat. That would be nice. And so you have in France discuter, but in Quebec jaser. But again, it's just a word. It's not like a whole language change, a whole restructuring of the whole damn thing. Just pick up a word and you got it. And similar thing for an expression if you want to say, okay, that's good. In France, again, c'est nous is suggestion. You would say, d'accord, c'est bon, which literally pretty much means agreed, it's good. And in Quebec, you might hear, okay, c'est bon. And okay, instead of d'accord, these two are synonyms. And it's not like European French speakers have never heard anybody say okay to mean d'accord. So it's something that, although there's different habits in Quebec, is not something that's going to keep a French Canadian from being understood if they're in France. And then, of course, oh, speaking of some influence from English, if we want to say you're welcome, in France, you might hear someone saying de rien, which literally means of nothing, which I like that. It's a good way of saying, oh, it was nothing, you're welcome, no big deal. And whereas in Quebec, you might hear bienvenue, which means literally it means welcome, not as in you're welcome, but welcome to other French speakers. And so it got barred enough, I think, in the meaning because this is making it a little more like English, using the welcoming thing to after someone says thank you. Although it's not English so much on its face, but I do think there's there's a pretty direct link there from exposure, contact with English. And then again, there's just some slightly different turns of phrase that are not so difficult to pick up for foreigners. Like in France, if someone's wanting to say, oh, see you next time, they might say, à la prochaine. So, à la prochaine, three different words. Whereas in Quebec, you might hear just à prochaine, just à and then prochaine with 2 words. But again, I'm not feeling like this would be like it's not like these two language varieties are so far different that nobody could understand each other. It's about sort of getting over yourself a little and listening to their accent. Um, and then, yeah, picking up a handful of words. Just like, again, if for an American going to visit England, I suggest you get used to using the word slacks and trousers, or maybe just jeans, right? That could work because we don't want to say pants over there, right? And so the last little example I wanted to bring up of how certain little bits of vocabulary are different in France versus in Quebec is when we're saying goodbye. Um, of course, au revoir, right? Au revoir, which literally means until we see again, until we see each other again, sort of au revoir. That's why you see in a lot of movies, oh, let's not say goodbye, let's just say au revoir. Because there's an assumption that you will see each other again in a way, in the word itself, in the choosing of the word. And this is something a lot of people do notice about Quebec. They might use the term bonjour to mean goodbye. A lot like in France, you might say bonne journée, as in have a nice day. In Quebec, might say the word bonjour to mean goodbye. Or again, in the evening time, you might hear someone saying bonsoir, which again in France, that's a greeting only. But in Quebec, some people are using this to say goodbye, to take your leave of somebody. And so, yeah, I just wanted to pull out those few examples. I guess it was 12 examples exactly, just a dozen of them, just to give a smattering of, yeah, there are some differences between French in Quebec and French in France, but the differences are minuscule as compared to what people might think. It's mostly about adjusting your ears, understanding, climbing onto an accent a little bit better, and picking up a few different vocabulary words. Kind of like American English is different than British English. French Canadian French or Québécois is different from French from France, but not by too far because again, they're the same language, same structure, same grammar, and all that, but just substitute a few words that you're plugging in and yeah, help adjust your ears to understand a new accent, and you're good to go. There's not really that much difficulty to it. So if I would recommend, if anybody is a college student thinking about studying abroad, um, I would say if you have an opportunity to go to Quebec or an opportunity to go to France, either way is good because either way your French is going to be getting a lot better. And either way is going to be a French that other people can understand, even if they're not from the very country that you studied abroad in. Oh well, so there is that. So I think that was all the points I wanted to make and all the stuff I wanted to cover there. Now, does anybody have a question about relating to French in Quebec or French in North America that I could tackle? If anybody has one, please write them in the chat. Or I suppose if you're watching this on the replay, please don't be afraid to write a comment. Comments are especially good for the algorithm. Anyway, I would like to hear that. And so, still waiting to see if no, no real questions coming in. Okay, well, I guess then in that case, this live stream has lasted plenty long. We've been on we've been live for nearly 55 minutes now, so I think this might be a good place to call it quits. And so, yeah, I will, yeah, I look forward to coming back to more with some more French lessons du jour, which I already have my next one picked out. It's three different words you can use, even if you don't know much French, but while you're traveling, and they will help you so much if you're in France, checking out the museums in Paris or something like that. But anyway, um, or in restaurants or stores. But anyway, I guess you'll have to catch that short video in order to know what I mean exactly. But yeah, I wanted to say thank you so much for hanging out with me on this Friday night. There's nowhere I would rather be than here on YouTube, hanging out with you. And yeah, so I guess yeah, I will get working on that French lesson du jour pretty quick so I can get it to you as soon as possible. And so until then, catch you around next time. Bye.